Hij is de uitvinder van de virtual reality. En niet alleen dat, hij is muzikant. Hij heeft een enorme verzameling muziekinstrumenten. Maar hier gaat hij praten over zijn inzicht in de wereld. Zijn filosofie. En die is heel belangrijk. Jaron Lanier is een grensverleggend filosoof. Iemand die inzichten heeft in de relatie tussen techniek en mens. En om te beginnen gaat hij praten over inktvissen en scuttlefish. Een bepaald soort inktvis.
Cuttlefish. Do you understand what I mean when I say cuttlefish? It's related to squid. It's kind of halfway between a squid and an octopus. So this is a giant cuttlefish. It's about this big. And it lives near the atoll called Palau in the Pacific Ocean. And it has a very remarkable quality. You're probably familiar with how some squid can change colors. And the way they do this is with a special organ in the skin that's called the chromatophore layer. If you look at the chromatophore, what it is it's a layer of cells that can expand and contract very quickly, and the cells have different colored pigments inside them. Each of the cells connects by a nerve to a special lobe in the brain of this type of animal that can make it open and close. So that's how the squids change color so quickly. That's what's going on. Now what's remarkable, among other things, about this new giant cuttlefish is that it has a full red, green, and blue display covering its whole body. And it can change every pixel individually faster than television can, about 40 times a second. So it essentially has television all over its body, right down to the tips of its tentacles. It also emits a little bit of light, so it glows a little bit. Also, underneath this layer of skin is a layer of muscle, and the muscle can be raised into welts, so it can create sort of mountain ranges and shapes on its skin. Now, watching this animal move around is absolutely remarkable. It's a piece of magic. In fact, one of the things that's really a shame is that we discovered it after computer graphics had already gotten pretty good. Because now when you see it, everyone just thinks, well, it must be a fake. This was done with computer graphics. If only we could have discovered this maybe 10 years earlier, it would be the most famous thing in the world right now. I'm convinced the only reason you haven't heard of it is that it doesn't quite register in people's minds that this is something real. Now, what this creature can do is the thing that I think all of us long for on a very deep level, which is that it can express the world equally well as it can perceive the world. And there's a tragic element of the human condition, which is that we can't do that. We can perceive the world with more facility than we can express. We can see an image as quickly as we experience it, but in order to create an image to send out in the other direction, we have to sit and draw it or create it with a computer graphics program or any of the other many ways that we have of generating images. So we're terribly handicapped, and this new creature, which doesn't even really have a good name yet, can teach us about that. Now, when these creatures come into contact with each other, these giant cuttlefish, they start making patterns to each other. They appear to be communicating with a visual language. Nobody knows really very much at... a big white disc. Nobody knows very much at this time about this language. There's a woman already at work on a dissertation trying to make a cuttlefish dictionary, and she's already got entries on 80 distinct patterns. Watching the patterns is fantastic. They go into spirals and they go into spiderweb type things and things that look like a sea retreating on the sand after a wave. Many other patterns. Absolutely fantastic. Watching them have sex is really wonderful. Much, much more interesting than watching people have sex. So, this could be very bad news for the Amsterdam economy, I suppose. There's one videotape I have seen of a cuttlefish moving in front of a reef, and scrolling across its skin, the reef that's on the other side of it, in order to have perfect camouflage. It simply disappears. Now, the most amazing thing about this, of course, is that in order to do this, it has to know in its mind where the observer is. So it's aware of the complete transaction. And this brings up a very interesting point about the cuttlefish. Many of us have been interested for years about the nature of intelligence in dolphins and whales, in the cetaceans. But you know, the problem with dolphins and whales is that they're tragically handicapped in a different way than people are. The human brain evolved in a loop of feedback with the human hand. The two things go together. And so we were able to grow our brains in our evolutionary process by doing things and observing what happened. Whales and dolphins can't do that to the same degree. They have a little bit of a chance to affect the world, but for the most part they move through the world and communicate with each other. So they have a different, their brains have to have evolved in a different way. In contrast, the cuttlefish brain, which is pretty sizable, it's a pretty big animal, has evolved in concert with its tentacles. Now, these tentacles are really quite amazing. The whole of the animal is a parallel evolution to people. The cephalopods, which are the squid, the octopus, and the cuttlefish, as well as many lower creatures. The cephalopods have eyes that are actually better than human eyes. They don't have blind spots. They have wonderful brains that are arranged in a circular pattern of lobes. So instead of just having a right and a left brain, they have a bicycle wheel of brains. They really can think in 3 dimensions. They propel themselves with jet power. They can start at any position and move in any direction. They can be simultaneously reaching and looking in any direction. So people actually live in a 2.5-dimensional universe. We walk across 2-dimensional ground for the most part, and we look forward into a 2-dimensional plane for the most part. We are 3-dimensional, but only slightly. It actually takes us a little while to learn 3-dimensional things, which I'll talk about a little bit with regard to virtual reality, of course. But here we have these creatures which can manipulate, and I should point out some of the larger squid have been observed using tools in the wild. There's a scale that a large squid pulls off a fish and uses to open shellfish. So here we have a tool-using creature with this parallel evolution of a different type of brain, different type of eyes, different manipulators, and a superior ability for visual expression. The thing I dearly wish is that they'd had a chance to evolve a little bit further by now. But the thing I want even more is to be one of them. I very, very much want to be a cuttlefish. And this is the real reason why I have dreadlocks. You see, they're my tentacles. I've been stopped at every corner in Amsterdam by people thinking I must be a Rastafarian in search of dope. And actually, I've never tried marijuana even. I've always had an intuition it wasn't the right thing for me. And my hair just does this genetically. I can't help it. But I finally understand what it's really for. It's my gradual transformation into a cuttlefish, which will be accomplished by a combination of my hair with virtual reality equipment. Now, I mentioned the cetaceans, whales and dolphins. I can't let that pass without just mentioning a cousin of the cuttlefish, and we'll be coming back to the cuttlefish in a second, which is the giant squid. Now, you all know about the giant squid, right? Anybody know about that? The giant squid is one of the largest animals in the world. The largest one that's been found dead is about 90 feet long. So they're huge, huge squids. Now, what's interesting about the giant squid is it's another member of the cephalopod family. And it's the only animal in nature that we know for sure exists that we have never seen alive. It's evaded us. Now, this is a creature with a really big brain, the same sort of brain that the cuttlefish has, a big cephalopod brain, wonderful eyes as big as hubcaps. The brain's as big as a small car, well, maybe like a small, I don't know, a 2CV or something like that, a little car. These things are probably really smart. I think the fact that they've avoided us is a pretty good intelligence test. I think they're really on the ball. The way we know they exist is we find their dead bodies, and we see the damage they do to sperm whales, because they and sperm whales are sworn enemies. They compete at the top of their food chains. Now, the competition between the giant squid and the sperm whale is really quite amazing. The sperm whale's weapon, since it doesn't really have manipulators, is a sound organ. That's what the sperm material is for. It's a focusing agent that creates intense sound waves that focus in front of it and are powerful enough to rip apart a large creature like a giant squid. So it uses this sound power to try to attack the squid. The giant squid, meanwhile, while it might be a soul brother and a wonderfully intuitive, visually expressive creature, is probably mean as hell. Instead of suckers, they have these horrible razor blade-like fangs along their tentacles. And they have these huge, horrible, sharp beaks that they use to devour whale meat when they get to it. And there are quite a few very badly damaged sperm whales floating around out there. Now, we don't know if the giant squid has a highly expressive chromatophore or not, since we've never seen them alive. Nonetheless, I usually call the contest between the giant squid and the sperm whale disco versus punk, because the sperm whale is fighting the squid with sound, and then the squid is fighting back with a light show. Now, when I say that the squids fight back with a light show, I don't know if the giant squids do, but this cuttlefish I've been talking about actually does. The way it hunts is quite marvelous. It hunts using avant-garde art. What it does is it goes up to something it wants to eat, and just sits there, and then it puts on this incredible show of bizarre changes where it turns into different animals. The creature doesn't know what animal it's trying to defend against, becomes completely confused, and while it's stunned, it simply gets eaten. No muss, no fuss. It's a remarkable thing to watch. It's absolutely struggle-free. It reminds me of like an artist kind of, pulling one over on some funding agency, come in and do some great demo and then get the money, It's the same sort of thing. Now, the fact that the cuttlefish is out there gives us, at least it gives me, some inspiration that some of the thoughts I've had about virtual reality for a long time aren't too far off the track of what's possible. I have a belief that most of the things that we imagine and invent actually already exist in nature, and that the process of invention is really a process of re-exploration. And so to find this visual expression already existing, and on our own planet nonetheless, without even having to go to another planet, is a pretty good sign that it might be possible. So, how do we become cuttlefish? How can we become as expressive towards the world as we can be perceptive of the world coming into us? Well, I've tried a few different ways in the course of my career. Obviously, there's virtual reality, which I will get to. I can mention a few other inventions that haven't been as successful, though. One is the animated digital tattoo. I did design a working way for people to have a chromatophore, and it involved electrofluorescent inks deposited in the skin in a grid pattern so that you could have a working display in your skin. And I figured out a way to control them and turn individual ones on. Many years ago, I did some work with interfacing silicon chips and nerves directly with a mad scientist at Stanford named Joe Rosen, who you might have heard of as well. But at any rate, I know a little bit about how to interface nerves and things. So I figured out a way to have a tattoo machine that would deposit an animated tattoo, and then you would tuck a little controller chip under your skin. And you could have, well, God forbid, television showing on your skin, but perhaps you could have an interesting video game flowing across your skin, or just a movie, or perhaps you could become like a cuttlefish and really learn to communicate, really become expressive. I don't have the guts to actually try this. So it's going to have to wait for some generation of kids in the future who are really crazy enough to do it. And I will pretend to be shocked just to make them feel good when it happens. Now, there are many other ways to possibly become a cuttlefish, and I won't discuss them all here, but I do want to propose a theory that the history of culture, of people, can be understood as a series of attempts to become cuttlefish. If you look at many of the sort of departments in the university, they can be understood as different strategies for becoming more expressive, for building bridges to each other. The particular way that people happen to be, the particular way that the ball rolled and down the hills of evolution in order to create us, is really limited and tragic in some ways and glorious in other ways. We do have the capacity for abstraction, we have hand-eye manipulation, we have a capacity, we have a plasticity in our minds, so we can have this thing called culture, and we can have remarkable facilities like language arise. This is really a miracle. I should, just if you haven't thought about this, the fact that language exists is probably the most miraculous natural effect that we can see right now in the universe that we've known so far. Here you have the brain that evolved before there was language, and suddenly we have language which actually has a specialized center in the brain. Now that's a pretty amazing thing. When you try to understand how language works, you can't. There are many professions that are built around attempts to explain how a conversation could be possible. Oh, thank you so much. Trying to find out where the meaning is really hiding. And none of them work out. They always fail. We don't even have the beginning of a clue of how meaning works, how language can happen. Nonetheless, language is one of our attempts to become a cuttlefish. Language is one attempt to bridge this gap, but there are many others. There are... Oh, for God's sake! Hard drugs. Oh, no. Oh, my God. Wow. Oh, I don't know. The reputation of this place is really going to become... Does anybody want to eat some chocolate while I'm talking? No? Okay. Seriously, this is a considerable amount. Okay, all right. Here, you want some? All right. Do you want the milk or the dark?
I want the dark.
The dark, okay, good. I'm glad the audience has excellent taste. Okay. Now, when I was talking about that old human condition, this thing we're so familiar with. So our condition is to be separated from one another. We have this miraculous sense of experience. We experience being alive at every moment, and then off in the distance, through the holes of our sense organs, we see each other. Maybe. This depends on how meaning really works. It might not quite be that way, and I'll talk more about that. This might be the wrong model. But at any rate, we're a little connected together and a little separated. And I think we proceed through life with a basic faith that the other people are really out there and that communication is something real. This is the core faith of life. Now, I'm going to approach this idea slightly differently now by talking about the experience of young children. I'm going to present to you a notion of how young children grow up and what they experience. But interestingly, even though all of us were children, it's enormously difficult to really know what's going on in children's heads and in their hearts. We can approach it, but we can't quite get there. Our own origin is hidden from us, which is another aspect of the tragedy of our condition, that we're floating here in this void. We don't really know where we came from or where we're going. We can never quite tell. There are these barriers on all sides. Now, here's my theory about children. I think that when they're very small, they experience the world essentially as their own imagination. Their own imagination is the world. They haven't quite figured out the difference yet. So when they imagine something, it's essentially real. Now this creates a wonderful momentum for imagination because it's so rewarding. It's as if you just think of something and it pops into being. Of course you'd want to think of many things. What a marvelous reward. So this creates this sort of engine of creativity which makes children so delightful and inspiring to us. Now, of course, the other problem is it makes them into little egomaniacs that can drive us crazy because they haven't learned to accommodate other people yet. They're just the king of their universe. So those are the two sides of being the ultimate ruler of the whole universe: incredible creativity and annoying egomania. You can see this in the Old Testament as well. But at any rate, there comes a certain point in every child's life in which a terrible insult takes place, a horrible, horrible demotion. The child starts out as king of the universe, and then a horrible piece of information is presented, which is that there's actually another layer of reality out there, different from the layer of imagination, and this is called the physical world. And it turns out that the physical world is the only place where mom exists, it's the only place where food exists, it's the only place where sustenance can happen or comfort. It's the only place where you're not alone. And unfortunately, this very, very important layer of reality called the physical world happens to be one in which the child is nothing but a pathetic little pink, helpless piece of clay, a little untrained, bubble of wax, something that has no power at all. And this is the most revolting, difficult shrinkage imaginable. Children simply cannot accept this news. How can the king of the universe turn into this little piece of clay? Now, very, very gradually, children come to accept it. They come to accept the fact that this physical world, where they don't have to be alone, where they find their sustenance, is one in which they're limited. Now, some people never quite get it, I think. But when people do get it, that's when we call them adults. Now, children love virtual reality. And I think one of the reasons that they love virtual reality is that when they see it, they intuitively can tell that virtual reality represents a new solution to this dilemma of the internal world where you're God of the universe and the external world where you're not alone. Virtual reality is a place that is shared and objective, just like the physical world, and yet fluid like the imagination. It has both qualities. And this is something new. This is something that hasn't existed before. Now, it's something we've tried to approximate many times. I can list the many ways. I can talk about art and architecture. I can talk about language. I can talk about many, many things. But truly, at this point, the cuttlefish comes closer than anything else. Now, improvised music in groups is also related. When improvising musicians work together, they can spontaneously create together. They can create as quickly as they think. In fact, in a certain sense, when you play music, you can create faster than you think because your body is smarter than your mind and can make decisions at a faster rate than your mind could. This question of speed is critical. If the cuttlefish took a whole day to assemble an image on its body, nothing would be accomplished. It would starve. And it would be in this, or it would become a person, essentially. Which is perhaps worse. I don't know what they would think. But let's talk about language for a second as an example, because this really illustrates this long-term project of humanity to bridge the interpersonal gap in a very interesting way. What is language? Language is a way of using the tiny parts of the universe that you can control as fast as you think and feel, in the same way that the cuttlefish can control its skin as fast as it thinks. But to use those parts to refer to all of the other things in the universe, all the possibilities that you don't have enough power to actually make real. So, in order to show you what I mean, I'm going to demonstrate by using some language. I'm going to say that all of us in this room are about to turn into fluid, ruby cuttlefish. And we're all dancing the samba on porcelain gondolas floating above the clouds of Saturn. Now, that was really quite easy for me to do. I think I perhaps expended 1/4 of a calorie to do that. I mean, I just moved my tongue around as fast as I thought. No problem. Now, to actually realize what I just said as an experience would cost many, many billions, trillions of dollars. I would have to accelerate the space program so I could get this many people to Saturn. I would have to accelerate genetic engineering so I could turn us into ruby squid. I'd have to pay for the samba lessons. I mean, we're talking about trillions of dollars, and I saved all that money just by flicking my tongue around. Now, that is the magic of symbols. Symbols let us use the tiny part of the universe we have power over to refer to the much larger part that we don't. And that's how we're able to sneak around the fact that we're not cuttlefish. Okay, that's our sneaky method. Now, children learn this. The laundry's done. Children learn this, and they learn all of the other methods. They learn all of the interpersonal relationships we have, the subliminal cues. Some of them learn to make art or play music. And all of these things are part of this great human adventure of overcoming the tragedy that's of limitations that has been left to us by evolution. I should just say a bit about evolution. I've been talking about evolution here tonight. Just to be very clear, sometimes people talk about evolution as a positive thing and as something that should go on in the future. We need more evolution, and if we do this or that, we'll evolve more. I just wanted to present to you my understanding of evolution, just to give a bit of context. Evolution is a really bad thing. Evolution is the victor's word for genocide. Every little thing about you that is determined by your genes, like the shape of your nostrils, and many things about the shapes you like to see in nature and the way you speak, and all of these little details about you exist in you only because all of your possible ancestors who might have given you different genes were killed in terrible ways. That's where it comes from. Evolution is the very, very heart of cruelty. It is precisely the victor's word for genocide. It's an evil thing. It's very much like the Hindu deity Kali. It's a terribly destructive force that creates new growth in its wake. So it's a very evil thing that creates growth and goodness in its wake, and yet it's critically important to resist it. We must always resist evolution. Evolution is the thing that people are trying to facilitate in eugenics programs and so forth, and we must end it. The opposite of evolution is compassion, in which people who are disabled can still live lives and pass on their genes, as one example. Civilization can be understood, in addition to the attempt to turn into cuttlefish, as also being an attempt to resist evolution. At any rate, having said that, this devastating process of evolution has left us with certain facilities and certain lack of facility, and we now have this adventure called culture, in which we try to overcome the particular hand of cards that we've been dealt by this very, very unfortunate process that gave us birth. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about virtual reality, finally. Virtual reality is if it's done well, if it works as I hope it will, another great adventure in overcoming the interpersonal gap. I don't believe this adventure will ever have a conclusion. I don't believe there will ever be a perfect fusion of all minds. But there are many adventures along the way to trying to achieve the closeness that evolution has denied us. Language being the most important one so far. Whether virtual reality will ever become as rich as language, I don't know. Now, what do I mean when I say virtual reality? There's been a little bit of a problem with the term because it's been used so much that it doesn't really mean anything anymore. And this is very frustrating to me because I thought if I made up a new term I would at least get to define it, but it doesn't work that way. What actually happens is if you make up a good term, it gets used for everything in the world. It's been an insane situation. In America, in the last political election, every national American politician accused every other one of living in virtual reality. And they meant it as an insult. But I kept track, every single one. Bush said, Clinton, he just lives in virtual reality. So, on the other hand, it's used as a compliment too. The last Frank Sinatra record that came out had a thing on the back saying, Frank Sinatra creates a virtual reality with his voice. Which I thought was a little better. I kind of like that. Another funny one a couple of years ago was a movie called Disclosure, which was essentially a movie about sex that had one virtual reality scene. And everybody talks about that virtual reality scene. Now, usually what you'd have is you'd have like some science fiction movie about, weird future technologies, then you'd put in one sex scene in order to make sure people actually came to see it. But in this case, you have the sex movie, and you need to put in a virtual reality scene. And so I've decided that has to count as an endorsement. And it hasn't all been a waste of time after all. So I can tell you what I originally meant by virtual reality, and then talk about a few issues related to it, and then go into the core of the discussion, which is something called post-symbolic communication. Now, what virtual reality originally meant was social simulations. So people had talked about putting individuals into simulators before. There was an important early researcher named Ivan Sutherland in the 60s who actually built an early head-mounted display. That was the first one. What nobody had ever done before was think of putting more than one person at a time into a simulation. That was the thing I was very excited about, for the reasons I've described, out of the hope that maybe within this shared world that's simulated, we might be able to get the best of both of the worlds we've had before. The fluidity of imagination and the objectivity of the physical world. So I made one of these things in the early 80s. It was extremely thrilling, an extraordinary experience. Being inside a shared virtual world, you see another person, and at that time, what another person looked like in virtual reality was really just some triangles. There's barely anything representing them. But somehow you could still feel them there. Somehow there was a presence there. And this gets back to what I said before about the fundamental faith of human beings, that there really is some sense to communication, that we really are contacting another experiencing soul out there on the other side. And somehow you could feel that in this very, very early simplistic virtual world, which was absolutely amazing. So, in order to make virtual reality work, you have to fill all the human sense organs with the stimulus that they would receive if the person was in an alternate reality. Now, the problem with that is that it's an impossible goal because, well, for one thing, some of the sense organs are inside the body, so to really achieve this, you'd have to do rather severe surgery, to stick devices in to stimulate somebody's inner ear and so forth. But for another thing, the human sense organs are very refined. Now, I'll mention at this point an interesting debate that comes up sometimes. The question is, Will virtual reality ever become perfect? Will it ever become so good that you couldn't distinguish it from physical reality? And some people think it would, and the reason they think that is they perform tests to measure how well the eye can see and how well the skin can feel and all that. They tabulate the tests and then they say, well, if we continue at the present rate of development, by the year 2030 we'll have a display that can make everything the eye can see, and by the year 2040 we'll have tactile displays that can create every sensation the skin can feel. And then they say, well, once we're done with all of that, plus we have the really fast computers we'll have, then we're done. It should perfectly simulate reality. Now, I actually disagree with that, and I'll tell you why. If you go back 100 years to the origin of audio recording, you will find reports of experiments that were done asking people to compare what they heard from very early audio recording technologies and what they heard from live people. Now, the early recording technologies were really terrible. You know, wax recordings. Now, at the time, subjects who heard comparisons would say they sound identical. There were double-blind tests done where people couldn't tell them apart. And then there were non-blind tests done where there would be an opera singer and a recording machine, and people would say they sound the same. How could this be possible? Well, the difference between then and now is that we've learned to hear better. Audio technology has taught us how to hear better, and it continues to teach us how to hear better. Today, you can go to a high-end audio store and listen to the most expensive pair of speakers in the house and compare them to the second most expensive pair of speakers in the house, and you can hear a difference, and yet neither of them sounds real to you. You wouldn't confuse either of them with a live musician. And every year as the speakers get better, you're learning to hear even better. Media technology teaches us to perceive nature better in this sense than we did before, with more acuity. Now, how is this possible? The reason it's possible is that human sensation is not a linear process where you simply decode numbers at a certain resolution inside the brain. Rather, it's an active, creative process in which the brain is coming up with clever strategies, interesting heuristics, interesting approximations in order to figure out what's out there. And because it involves creativity, creativity implies infinity. There's no end to it. So, the way I usually try to explain this is that if you could get a time machine and you could send yourself 300 years into the future and try out a virtual reality machine as it would exist then, there is no doubt that you would be fooled. You would not be able to distinguish it from reality. If, however, you are alive in 300 years, you will be able to distinguish it. And the reason why is that you will have seen each new wave of improvements in virtual reality technology coming, and you will have gradually been able to adjust your own internal subconscious strategies for perceiving it. You will get to perceive it better and better and better, and your perceptions will, I believe, stay ahead of the technology. So, this is all to say that I believe virtual reality machines will never be perfect, and yet it doesn't matter. The goal of virtual reality is not to perfectly simulate an alternate world, but rather it's to trick your brain into helping you perceive the virtual world. Okay?
Tot zover weer een paradox van Jaron Lanier. Een enigma in de wereld van de techniek. Iemand tussen kunst en technologie. De uitvinder van de virtual reality en iemand wiens filosofische inzichten werkelijk baanbrekend zijn. We komen nog weer een keer bij hem terug. Dit was het programma Bora Bora. Kleurnet gaat over naar de strijdbijl, zoals iedere donderdagmiddag.